the distress of being a clinician working in the mental health industry that actually just wants to sort of suck the life out of you so that you maintain the same approach as everybody else. That was probably as distressing for me as being a patient in the system.
Today's guest is Matt Ball.
Yeah, I don't believe in diagnoses. They're made up. I mean, they exist because we use them, but they are made up in so much as they are an ideology of how we can categorize humans. What if we say that everyone that's suicidal, everyone that contemplates ending their own life, every community member will feel the pain of that? So let's not ask them to carry it alone. We should be talking about a drug-based model rather than a disease-based model. And then we can get to saying, what is it that would be most useful for you with the life that you live?
There's a difficulty in being, and I wonder if you could speak about the origin of that difficulty.
Yes, I was born.
Hello everybody, and welcome to this Peer for Peer podcast. These Peer for Peer podcasts are dedicated to conversation and storytelling about peer work and the people with lived experience in the mental health industry. Today's guest is Matt Ball. He is a nurse practitioner, psychotherapist, and founder of Humane Clinic. Hello, Matt. How are you?
Oh, hi, Rob. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks. Good.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I have a few questions for you. I was reading through your website, and I really loved this term or concept or whatever you might want to call it. It's advocacy towards autonomy. Could you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I think about, I learned about advocacy many years ago in the UK, and I was probably quite surprised what advocacy was about. So I'm sure different people have different ideas, but in my mind, it's about hearing what a person is trying to articulate and making sure the other person's heard that, and then understanding what somebody else is trying to articulate so the person understands that, so that we can communicate in a kind of clarity or something. And I suppose, you know, if we're communicating with clarity, then we have autonomy to decide what we want to communicate and how we want to respond to communication. Whereas if we don't really know what someone's saying, or we don't feel like someone's hearing us, then it's hard to have autonomy within that relationship.
Right. And you have something called Just Listening that goes on at the Humane Clinic. But could you just explain the, in inverted commas, just listening?
Yeah, sure. Just Listening came from actually from a book, and it's important that I acknowledge the authors of the book, Stephen Gans and Leon Redler. They published a book called Just Listening, which is about offering sort of justice in hearing somebody else, and a just listening as a just process. So it doesn't mean I'm just listening, I can't bother to do anything else. It's a very busy and active journey of listening, but it's about saying whatever you have to say is really worthy of justice. So my role is not to correct you, to fix you, to even deeply understand you. My role is to listen with a sense of justice that you know, you have a knowing, you have the wisdom. What my role is to be present so you can hear your own wisdom as it comes from you, rather than me having to pretend I'm wiser or know more or can be more clever. So Just Listening was about saying, how do we move into spaces of listening that allows the person to hear themselves outside of themselves rather than just inside themselves?
Yes, I love that, to hear your voice come out, and so that you can hear yourself speaking. And that's sort of about, it's about being genuinely present, isn't it? Can you explain how someone can be genuinely present?
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the things that's missing in mental health world, if you like, or supporting people or listening in my mind, is that we don't hear our own stories. So I'm doing this now. I'm explaining my own stories because you've invited me to. But if I'm explaining my own stories to you and you want to tell me your story, then my stories are going to get in the way. So as the listener, it's really important. I hold all of my stories. They're all valid. They all deserve to be heard and seen. But the moment I start laying those stories on you, we're going to have problems where I'm not really listening to you anymore, and I'm not trying to offer justice to the importance of your narrative. So The process really for me is about the listener taking responsibility and care and nurture of what they need so they can get out of the way.
Yes, and it's about the importance of, is it getting through your story? Is it like someone would go through from the beginning, the middle, and then end, and just talk it through and get through it, and then sort of see what's left? Is that what we're sort of aiming for?
Yeah, in part, yes. And that's certainly what some people do. I think some people come in to tell a story about A, B, and C, and they end up telling a story about F, J, and Q. And how do we offer justice to that? Because we're all kind of set up in mental health world and even in families and communities to, oh, I've got time to listen to this little bit of the story and I'm here in this role. But what if someone, what if I go over to the shop next door to my work and I went to buy chocolate, but I want to tell the person about my day, and their job's to sell me chocolate, not really to listen in any depth about my day. And so how do we let people tell which parts of the story are actually important in that moment? And then say, oh, if you needed to come back and buy chocolate, that's fine as well. Tell that story as well.
Yeah.
So just listening when we offer it here, we're saying you could come back today and tomorrow, or you can come back twice today if you want. That's okay. Because you've probably got different stories in different moments and you might not choose to tell them all in order. So yeah, just listening to whatever it is that is important for that person in that moment.
And that leads on to how important connection is, right? Like intrinsic care, the importance of being connected, not only to other people, not only to yourself, to the world, just completely connected. Tell us about that, the importance of that.
Yeah, well, everything we do is interconnected. I mean, one of the philosophies, and it's a small part, but one of the philosophies behind just listening is Buddhism and the sort of interconnectedness of all beings. So everything that happens affects everything that happens. So there is, the person that walks past our building today and sees the big sun on the front, they have a reaction to that. So us painting a picture on the front of our building has a reaction. It's connected. The animals, when we did renovation works on our building, we displaced animals. There's no doubt about that, living things. That has an impact. We don't need to overly worry about it, but we could take care to notice all the impacts of all these things. The little kids that walk past our building that used to see the lizards that probably don't live there anymore because we've renovated it. Those kids don't have the same story as last year's kids because they're not seeing the wildlife that's there. So we don't need to try and correct that. That's what's happened. But if we're going to offer justice to living, the little boy that says, my brother used to see lizards here on the way to school. Where are the lizards, Dad? Do justice to the fact that that child's noticed that something's not in his life that thought it was going to be in his life. Okay. Not dismiss it as, oh, come on, don't be silly. They moved. Well, there's important stories in all of this, listening and justice in listening.
Sure. I'd like to get onto something a little bit more serious, I suppose. It's voices, people that hear voices as not only separate to them, but also hear them as being violent, right? Is it all about how to discern the message that the voice is trying to convey, and what would be the first thing that you would do in terms, if someone were to come and having, severe issues with that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my first response to that is that hearing voices is just like any other experience. I've just noticed that my fingers are touching each other, but no one's concerned about that. So I'm not sure what we're concerned about from the external world. So then it becomes about offering justice to, you're distressed by the voices telling you you're describing as scary and problematic things. Yeah, okay, well, I want to offer justice to that fear, that vulnerability, that threat, instead of layering on my stories of, oh my goodness, you're hearing command hallucinations, which is, what the system would say. Well, those words don't really make any sense, command hallucinations. Just as assessing whether my knuckles and the ends of my fingers are touching in the correct way. There is no way to be in this world or not be. So that's where I think, for me, yes, voices bring messages. Yes, they bring meaning for some. For others, they want to think of those things as symptoms of mental illness. Now, I find that strange and weird, but other people find my view strange and weird. So what's important, if someone's had the courage and the integrity and the strength to say, I've got this experience that I'm finding difficult, could you listen? Well, the only real response I need to do is offer justice to what they're describing. And then from there, of course, we might end up hearing deeply important messages. In different cultures, they experience them differently. In different spiritual, religious contexts, they hear them differently. In different traumas, we hear them differently. And maybe it's useful to give you an example. When I first heard voices and had experiences when I was 13, it was not long after I'd left 12 or 13, not long after I'd left going to a church where I'd been abused. And I think for me, it makes sense that those voices were trying to articulate a problem that existed that I couldn't tell anyone because I didn't feel it was safe to, it wasn't allowed. So I had voices trying to force that narrative out.
Wow.
And everyone else looks at me and says, oh, you're crazy and you're dangerous. And I'm saying, no, the world's dangerous and crazy. So that's not some big spiritual or cultural thing. It's just quite a practical thing of my body and mind and spirit needs to get this out.
Sure, absolutely. It's part of being, and that was sort of my next question. There's a difficulty in being, and I wonder if you could speak about, the origin of that difficulty.
Yes, I was born.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I think one of the ways we can understand it in the reasonably recent era, or one of the ways I think about it, is sort of ontological insecurity. So the insecurity of being, we are born, we don't have a choice. We live life, we die, we don't have a choice. We don't know what happens next. Some people do, some people don't. But we can't say that with any absolute. There has to be an aspect of doubt which creates and feeds back into that insecurity of existing. And then I come across you today and what questions are you going to ask me? Well, I know we've talked before, but you might just throw something in I wasn't expecting. So then there's an insecurity of being in this moment. And then there's all the stories of what modern capitalist living is about, which is filled with anxieties of whether we can sustain that, whether that's possible to carry on. So, but Lang's work, R.D. Lang's work or narrative in the divided self on ontological insecurity, where he talked about ontological insecurity can lead to nihilism and a sense of not existing. And that's where sort of madness or voices or visions can come from. And for me, I would say that the reason why we try and stop people having those experiences is because when someone shows us voices, visions, or what we might think of as madness or craziness, or if you can have those experiences and we're mutually human, then that's scary for me, a state of being. Because if you could have voices that are scary, I too could have them. So I'm going to shut you down and stop you having them. And then that way I don't have to worry that it might happen to me. And so I think this sense of the difficulty with being with another person is that inherently threatens our sense of insecurity of being. Right. If that makes sense.
Yes, of course it does. Of course, it's the yes. Well, we are people and we feel empathy. But and we'll get onto that. But what I wanted to ask just before is, when somebody's contemplating suicide or having, suicidal thoughts, the narration of suicide, in your experience, is that about, that being alive that we were talking about is actually being unbearable? Is that what's happening in a number of the cases?
All cases.
Oh, right.
I know others would just. Yep. I mean, if I'm contemplating not being able to stay alive in this world, then I imagine that something in this world is making me contemplate it not being reasonable, acceptable, or secure to be here. So, the modern mental health system continues to parade this bizarre narrative of risk assessment related to mental illness. And yet we have laws like euthanasia that says when people's lives become intolerable, they're allowed to exit this life with choice and dignity. And I'm not suggesting we offer to help people end their lives if they're suicidal, but I am saying, if we can understand that in sickness and aging and dying, why would we not want to first try and understand the narrative that sits behind and within the story of someone contemplating it in their life? And the suicide narratives approach that we developed was about saying that the suicidal person is the wise person, not because we're not judging their decision to end their life, but what we're saying is they're bringing really important stories to our community that we can't hear, so that they're burdened by the difficulties of living that exist amongst us all. And if we're all interconnected, as I was talking about earlier, then actually we could share that burden by doing justice to listening to that narrative.
And that's what you do. That's what you do at Humane Clinic. Could you tell us a little bit about how it started, why it started?
Yeah,
What
Humane
your
Clinic
inspirations?
Yeah, my inspirations. I was a so-called patient in the mental health system, diagnosed with psychosis, and all the things that come with that, and sort of seemed not to be responding to traditional treatments. I would say they weren't treatments. I would say they were things done to me. I would say the treatment I received came from a couple of beautiful clinicians who were with me and treated me as a mutual human and invited me to treat them the same. And then I lived in a house with 7 other people that were said to be not responding to treatment around psychosis. And that was where I kind of really had this experience. We weren't peer workers or anything like that. We were peers in the sense that we had become liminal to society and deemed to be a bit crazy. And within that space, no one really focused, no one talked about diagnosis or risk. We tried to live together and be together. And that was an inspiration for me. And then I trained in various areas. And I suppose what I found was the trauma of working, or the distress of being a clinician working in the mental health industry that actually just wants to sort of suck the life out of you so that you maintain the same approach as everybody else. That was probably as distressing for me as being a patient in the system. And when I was a patient in the system, I had ECT and I was locked in a seclusion room and I was drugged up. But being berated and bullied and violated in the mental health system as a clinician was probably as distressing. And so it became untenable. And I thought, well, I don't really.
Sorry to interrupt, but that includes like problematic titles, diagnoses. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't believe in diagnoses. They're made up. I mean, they exist because we use them, but they are made up in so much as they are an ideology of how we can categorize humans. And so I don't believe in that anymore. I don't believe in risk assessments predicting the outcomes of human behavior because it's just not true. It's a silly thing to say. And yet our pillars and institutions, broadly under a sort of misogyny, patriarchal construct, say that that's true. So I decided, well, I'm going to be at odds with my ethics and my values if I don't go and do what I believe in. And hence we set up Humane Clinic. And the dilemma then, of course, is it's a private clinic. So we wanted to provide a really, really equal quality free service. And we set up Just Listening as a charity because it's an ethical dilemma to say, well, you can only have a service if you can pay. Because that's about privilege. That's about access. That's about discrimination in the context of poverty and various other oppressions. So.
Yes. And we speak about, the importance of people actually having, courage to speak their truth, to tell their story. What would be your advice to people to get into really getting to that point and succeeding in telling their story to someone who'll listen?
Well, I think I think the answer's in your question, the wisdom's in your question, telling it to someone that will really listen. I think we have a dilemma in the mental health field, industry, environment, where we ask people to share their stories. And I don't know how this is going to sound, but it can almost feel like a grooming process. So we invite people to share a story and be really vulnerable. And then suddenly it's on the internet. Suddenly it's in front of an audience. And you kind of can't gather it back in. Mm-hmm. And it can feel violating. It really can. There'll be many people watching or listening to this who know what I'm talking about. We don't talk about that because we want to move forward in a way of embracing people's stories and uniqueness. But so telling people that will listen, telling people that will want to offer justice as a priority. So my challenge to you would be, if I watch this back before it goes live and I say, oh, please don't put that online, I'm trusting that you're not going to put that online. Equally, 6 months down the line, I might say, can you remove that? That doesn't feel okay anymore. So I think for me, it's about telling stories in places where you're going to be offered integrity and justice. And then for the person who's going to offer that, is in whatever role you're working in or listening in, it's a joy to operate in an ethical way. There's a freedom in it, And so what do you need as the listener in order to know that you're going to continue to operate in a way that's safe and ethical for you? Because if you don't, you'll become a cropper of the system as much as the person who shared their story, I think. Yeah.
So from what I'm hearing, it's all about to continue to keep the focus on decisions and choices of the person. How important is that?
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes, that's the crux, right? Is that when I wake up today, I don't want to be oppressed. And when I go to sleep tonight, I'm going to be less ontologically insecure if I haven't faced oppression today. So how do we keep the choices and the decisions of living with the individuals, which comes with responsibility? But I think it's easier to take responsibility if you feel like everybody's trying to take responsibility. We can all take responsibility, and there's a freedom. And so I think that idea of choice. One of the things that I think is around in the modern era is this kind of shared decision making. And whilst I think there's some value in that, I think that what that ultimately means, well, it does mean, because the language means this, that we're going to make a shared decision. Well, I'm all right. I'll make decisions in my own life, if you don't mind. And I'd like you to make decisions in your life. So equally, that I might ask you not to publish this. You might ring me next week and say, I'm not sure where that video went, really, so we might not publish it. Oh, okay. And I'm not sure they're always shared decisions. I think sometimes they're about, if someone's got a need to make a decision to maintain autonomy, let's offer that space first. Because if I'm not vulnerable about something, I don't need to I can contribute to you feeling safer.
Yes, and it sounds like there's an importance on community and coming together, and yet it is quite difficult to come together. I mean, I know myself, certain neighbours I don't particularly want to socialize with, but so maybe is that like what the origin is of the difficulty of creating and developing community?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This is going to be a strange tangent, but I think it's related. Do you know about good neighbour fencing?
No.
Yeah, down in South Australia, we have these panels of colour-bond fencing. It's called good neighbour fencing, and it's like 6 foot high. And I presume it's called good neighbour fencing because you never see your neighbour. But maybe that just induces a sense of paranoia. What's going on behind that fence?
Yeah.
And so I think it does start the origin is in whether we can be in community, right? Whether we can be in relationship. And when we go back to suicide narratives, then what if we say that everyone that's suicidal, everyone that contemplates ending their own life, that is, every community member will feel the pain of that. So let's not ask them to carry it alone. Let's carry it as a community. I can face up to the numbers of people today while we're talking who are thinking about ending their life. We'll never hear about them because they don't figure in the numbers. But, there will be someone in the street that I'm in today who, in this moment, who's thinking about ending their life. And that's painful to me. And that's about community. And that doesn't frighten me. It doesn't make me more vulnerable. It feels good, actually, to care about any single soul that walks around you.
It certainly does feel good. It really does. And I hope more people can do it more and more. And which leads me to this question about sort of younger people and the problems that they're having with, again, going back to being alive and being a teenager or a younger person in schools. What do you have to say about those sort of things?
Well, I can't remember if we've talked about this before, but what I think about is that we kind of like to pretend we're more advanced as a species than we were 50 years ago and 100 years ago. And yet I wonder if we're still stuck in the idea that if a young person has something difficult to say, it's adults that can help with that. And what I know from my 14-year-old daughter and her friends is that when they need to speak to someone, They go through this dilemma at school. Okay, I've got something really painful I need to talk about, but I know that if I mention A, B, or C, then my parents get told. So actually what we do is shut them down. So they're perfectly skillful at sharing stories. And we beat that out of them by them having to decide which story they're allowed to share and which one they're not allowed to share, and whether they're going to be heard and what autonomy they can maintain. And so for me, that one of my dreams or hopes, I suppose, is that very, very soon we start going into schools and saying, what support is useful from adults? Because you're already doing beautiful stuff. So rather than going in and teaching them about the mental health industry, going in and saying, oh my gosh, could you teach us what you need? And then you can carry on doing really beautiful community and humanity, and we can try and aid you from afar as you invite us. I don't know what you think about that, but that's kind of where I'm at with it.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I wanted to get on to also another thing that's sort of quite important in peer work settings. That's setting boundaries. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that. Would it be sort of along the lines of, when someone is experiencing and speaking to me about their story, how would I be able to sort of be okay, stay myself and listen?
Well, I think the question is not so much in my mind about boundaries as much as what do you need? So maybe, like, it's hard to do on screen, but if there's three people and this is the speaker and this is the listener, then this person here who's not even in the room is equally important, because this person needs to be able to go and talk to this person so they can listen to this person. So I think I think boundaries are a social construct, and I think that we put boundary fences up around our properties that don't really exist other than in a practical form. So I think telling people what you can offer and then offering that is the only boundary we need to say. So I was in a meeting yesterday for a keynote I'm doing later in the year, and I told the CEO that maybe what she needed was me to tell her I loved her. And then I kind of had this anxiety in my chest and thought, are you allowed to say that in business meetings? I love you to the CEO. Well, all I meant was, I just want to be mutual with you. I don't really mind whether you're the CEO or not. But I was reminded that you should probably set these things up first. By the way, if you're going to have a meeting with me, I'm likely to say some slightly slushy stuff. Is that all right with you? So I think it's about telling people what you can offer and then offering that. And that's then about me managing my boundary and what support do I need to manage that.
And thank you for saying that. Sometimes I feel weird because I think it's all about respect. Like, I really do. I really think it's about developing that respect muscle. What do you think?
I love that. I love that idea. Like what I hear in my head, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that I'm going to set a boundary by being honest with you and respecting you. And if I don't say to you, please don't do that, or please don't do this, or I can't hold that today, then presumably you can do what you want, because I've offered myself to you. And that's about me respecting you. And so then one of the things we hear an awful lot in the mental health, isn't it, is about people, we got overwhelmed with someone's story. Well, maybe we needed to set up what we were available for before we did that. And that's respectful to both me and to you, rather than not telling you that. And then you tell me something, I find that, oh, by the way, I didn't want you to tell me that. And then shame comes in, guilt comes in, sense of inadequacy comes in. So yeah, I do like that idea of, if I really respect you, then I'll tell you what I've got available. Yeah.
Fantastic. Could you please tell us about your experience with medication and what is a good idea when handling medication and taking medication and side effects, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have my own journey of taking multiple polypharmacy prescribed drugs. High doses cause me lots of harm. I generally think we aren't honest about psychiatric drugs. So I think it's better to say we're going to give people a drug and just call it that. And what I think we should be doing is asking the person whether the effects of that drug, not the treatment of their illness. If you have olanzapine, do you like how it feels when you're on olanzapine compared to when you're not? No, I don't. Oh, would you want to try lorazepam? Okay. Do you want to try LSD? Do you want to try MDMA? Do you want to try cannabis? Do you want to try chocolate? I mean, these are all things that alter our states of consciousness, right?
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying be random about it and hand out drugs. I'm saying be in deep relationship and offer people the integrity and respect that they can tell us what's the most useful drug for them. So I think some people do like to be on long-term drugs. And with all the information and knowledge and justice to make their own choices, that's cool. I think some people like to have a box of olanzapine in the cupboard, and probably 2 or 3 times a year they take 5 mils of olanzapine. Well, I mean, that sounds pretty autonomous to me.
Why not? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, as we might take Panadol for a headache, but sometimes we might not. The headache's not bad enough, you know. So I really think Joanna Moncrief, the psychiatrist, talks openly about this, that we should be talking about a drug-based model rather than a disease-based model. And then we can get to the nub of saying, what is it that would be most useful for you in the now and ongoing with the life that you live? And so, and also I think we need to get to the point with psychiatric drug withdrawal. You know, in the UK, there's now guidelines on GPs supporting people to withdraw from antidepressants. We prescribe over 28 million antidepressants a year in this country, over 5 million antipsychotics. It's inevitable people are going to want to stop taking them.
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things we can all do is to stop being less frightened. You know, I was talking to Rory, who's a social worker here, and we were doing a podcast on drugs, and he was saying, I don't want to talk too much on this. I'm a social worker. And you're a nurse, mate, you're a prescriber, you know. And I suddenly thought, oh, no, that's the wrong way around, isn't it? I've got a set of science or pseudoscience that I churn out. Having a social worker, a peer worker, an OT, those people have got a very important community-based idea of how these drugs might or might not be useful. So no one person holds the key. You know, it's bringing together all the knowledge, but unfortunately at the moment, prescribing is in the power and domain of medicine and other prescribers. And that's a real dilemma, how we move towards being less frightened, not taking it less seriously, but being less frightened and supporting autonomy.
Matt, could you tell us a little bit about your opinion on the sort of, let's say, the classic model of psychiatric hospitals? And could you give us a quick sort of pros and cons?
Yeah, they provide asylum, which is what? Shelter in a moment of distress, as in there's a building that's over us. If we had people behaving in different ways, then we might not dislike hospitals so much. If you create new buildings but have the same values and principles and staffing going into them, then the same things will happen, just in a different building. So my view is that with all the fantastical new ideas, I don't see many new ideas, because underpinning that is the Mental Health Act and patriarchal structures that say, we know what's wrong with you and how to make you better. And tragically, all disciplines join in with that now, including at times peer work. And I think we can emancipate ourselves and say, wow, maybe hospitals aren't the worst thing in the world if they're supported in a beautiful way. So therapeutic communities are essentially hospitals, right? They're just the philosophy, the love, the compassion, the spirit of humans in them is different to a hospital. So I think we should be moving to healing spaces rather than hospitals. But that's about changing philosophy and culture, not the building.
Thank you for that answer. Could you maybe just answer one more question, if you don't mind? What is a psychotherapist's greatest challenge?
To get out of their own way and let the wonderful human emerge. I mean, it's a bit simplistic, but, you know, unfortunately, with all disciplines, we come with all these stories of what makes us good at what we're doing. And I think the greatest challenge is how to stay in a relationship that is primarily based in the request, the invitation, and the generosity of the person in inviting us to be with them. And so how do I manage myself to honor that and have respect for that over and over and over again? And in doing that, not sacrifice myself, be all that I am, but not allow all that I am to trample on the other person. Because more often than not, that's what's happened to them in their life. In one way or another, people have looked beyond them, done harm to them, caused them problems. Well, the biggest challenge is how I really manage myself to honor the other person.
Thank you so much, Matt, for that answer. I thank you, and thank you so much for the love and respect that you show for people. And thank you so much for answering all my questions today. Mm-hmm. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
And can I just say really quickly, thank you for listening, because I feel like you've really given me a platform to speak, and I'm really grateful. So thank you too.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to the Peer for Peer podcast. My name is Robert Nobilia. See you next time.